I was trained as a deal maker in mergers and acquisitions and fundraising, and that's what I really spent the bulk of my career doing. Then I retired when I was 46 in 2002. Took some time off to be with, to actually gain custody of my children, and then began to get very concerned about the global system and the credit crisis and all that, and started warning people about the shocks that I saw coming late 2006, early 2007, specifically concentrating on General Electric. So I'm not, my training, my real training, my professional credentials are more in how do you get transactions accomplished, what's a smart transaction, what's a stupid one. And but really since 2007 or so, I've just sort of been learning the media business by being a guest and writing and being interviewed and on radio, print, television, podcasts, etc., covering geopolitics, economics, investments, and last year in particular, a fair amount about charities and the Clinton Foundation and the presidential election.
Which is a great segue. I do want to mention that Charles is a graduate of Horace Mann School and Yale College, so he's no slouch when it comes to the areas that he's going to be talking about for the next hour or so. The other thing, too, I want to let people know at the top of the hour, in case you happen to have your computers handy, you can actually look up Charles online, Charles Ortel, ORTEL.com, and you can also follow him on Twitter, which is at Charles Ortel. That would be capital C, capital O, I think. I don't know if it's case sensitive, but I don't want to go into too much background. I think a lot of people might know you by your reputation anyway, and I hope they'll find out more about you. We want to get into the meat of things fairly quickly, and you touched on it. We as Canadians feel somehow that we are a little bit disconnected, I suppose, when it comes to the Clinton Foundation and the various things that the Clintons are doing. There are definitely some Canadian connections, but I'd like you to set things up just a little bit and give us a bit of background, how you got into this particular investigation, I suppose you'd call it.
Sure. So when I started on this, I came honestly by accident on the case of General Electric. It was a company down here around the world. It was very big and complicated, and nobody seemed to really understand what was going on at General Electric. And when I began to do my work in 2006 and 7 on that one, I quickly figured out that it was a very large mess. It was all told, counting the value of debt and the value of equity, $900 billion. So a very big international mess. And that became the kinds of things that I would try to focus on, large, complex international messes. Years later, a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, made the passing comment in 2015, I can't really figure out what the Clintons actually are doing with their foundation. What do you think they're up to, Charles? And realizing at the time that Hillary was certainly going to run for office and that, this would be a topic that would get a certain amount of attention, I actually came at it in the beginning thinking, maybe they're doing good things. I mean, I happen to have had the fortune in life to get to know members of the Bush family, and I know that they were bitterly upset when H.W. lost to Bill in 92. And so to see Bill and H.W. quickly get together after the late 2004, early 2005 tsunami, that really warmed my heart at first to say, well, that's two bitter rivals are actually going to get together in charity land, and maybe this Clinton changed and mellowed with age. So I began in really around February 2015 or so to reacquaint myself or learn really about the filings and what you could find out about what is called a public charity in the United States. A public charity is not like the Bill Gates Foundation. A public charity, like the Clinton Foundation in theory, is a charity that constantly solicits from the members of our public around the world and must pursue only purposes that are statutorily approved inside the U.S. and then in the foreign countries if it chooses to operate internationally. So our laws here in the United States are modeled like yours on English law, and the English law is very ancient. It was codified in 1601 based on centuries of practice. And it's pretty straightforward. And again, I'm not a lawyer. The basic concept is you and I, Johnny, couldn't get together and say, all right, we like to eat ice cream. and we're going to raise money from the public so that we can travel around the world comparing different types of ice cream. That's clearly not a charitable purpose.
Dang.
And in fact, the statute in the U.S. makes plain this is a charity, that isn't a charity, right? And there's a long body of history. So this thing was set up. What controls in the U.S. what a charity can do is a legal document called its Articles of Incorporation if it's a nonprofit corporation, which is typically what a charity is down here. In those Articles of Incorporation, they clearly must state if you want to be federally tax exempt in the United States, you must limit your purposes to specific purposes which are statutorily defined as being tax exempt. Mm-hmm. So, for example, education is one of those purposes. Operating in Little Rock, Arkansas, a presidential archive and related research facility to study the records created during Bill Clinton's 2 terms as president, that is not only covered in the general charity statute, but there's another statute called the Presidential Libraries Act of 1955, as amended in 1986, I think. That act defines what is an archive. Another related act defines what are presidential records. You know, this whole issue, for example, the missing emails, are those presidential records or not? Its statute gets into that in great depth. And then it considers, will this archive be given free and clear to the National Archives, our National Archives, or will a partial interest be given to the National Archives? And there's one set of rules if it's free and clear, and a much tougher set of rules if it's not free and clear. So this thing, from the very beginning, was only set up to do limited things, limited tax-exempt purposes, which were specifically, and as they should have been, limited to be, we're going to hold all these records in Little Rock and create an opportunity for scholars around the world to study what actually happened with the Clinton Foundation. It was never set up to do whatever Bill and Chelsea and Hillary decide to do when they wake up in the morning. You can't do a charity like that.
Right.
And more importantly than that, down here, there are, talk is cheap, and in political land, politicians love to talk about what they've done. They love to brag about everything they've done. But charities in the United States are strictly required, of very small size, to have truly independent accounting firms go in and check the books, really check the books and records of a charity to make sure that, A, the balance sheets and the cash flow statements and the income statements are all laid out in conformity with U.S. law, which is very strict, but B, to further test and check that monies raised up in Canada for one purpose are not used in Burma for another purpose or in Little Rock for another purpose. So it's a very strict offense, state law offense in the United States, and I think in Canada, a very strict penalties apply to people who might, let's say, go to Toronto and have a birthday party for Bill, raising money to fight HIV/AIDS, only to have that money used to build a presidential retreat on the top of the library with a 14,000 square foot outdoor garden and a 5,000 square foot penthouse. You can't do that under U.S. and, I believe, under Canadian law. Mm-hmm. So they have behaved, the Clintons have, as if these laws are just an annoyance. They're suggestions. They're not rules as far as they're concerned. And I should just also mention that it appears there's a great law firm. I don't know if this is allowed in Canada, but I'll do it anyway. But
sure.
There's a law firm I've run across. It's called the Bloomberg, Blumberg law firm, and I think it's in Toronto. And it's a law firm that appears to specialize on charity. Mm-hmm. And it has a lot of free memos on its site that explain the differences between U.S. law and Canadian law. So under Canadian law, simply put, your governments over time took the view that really, charitable activities that we do down here should in fact be performed by the government, not by private citizens. That, you don't need to have certain activities because your Canadian government is sort of takes a more aggressive view about what a government should do than we, in theory, do down here. Right. So there's a break in the tradition. And then both of our countries have this issue, why should a Canadian citizen get a tax deduction for making a donation to a charity that's based in Canada but operates in Africa? Why does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. And your rules are tougher than our rules on that. You can only, and I'm not practicing law, but I believe that a Canadian citizen is normally only allowed to take a tax deduction on foreign income if they have, on a donation to a charity that's operating internationally, if they have income in that foreign country.
Right.
I think there's a test like that, something like that. We don't have such a test.
Right.
But what we have is a test that if a U.S. charity operates internationally, before it does that, it's got to get clearance from the U.S., strict clearance, informed clearance. It's got to inform the IRS every defect that may exist with respect to the charity. All its paperwork has to...
When you say defect, what does that mean?
So if charities down here must be, and it's on my site explained, and with links to the supporting tough documents,
okay.
A charity in the United States must be organized, i.e. formed, and lawfully in compliance with all applicable law, state, federal, foreign law. And then it must be operated continually in compliance with law. So you can't organize something unlawfully and correct the problem later.
I see.
You also can't organize something lawfully and then operate it unlawfully. It's a two-pronged test, and it's very tough. And there are even memos written at the IRS that are online talking about illegal activity. So, for example, and it's in this memo, if you Google illegal activities and 501c3, you'll get to this memo, and it takes the humorous case of what happened when the mafia decided to operate a charity.
Right.
Clearly, you can't do that.
Oh. Well, it seems like a nice thing to do. Every time you say the word charity, people sort of go, well, these guys aren't so bad. They're nice guys, these mafia guys. Yeah, it's interesting how as soon as you add charity to the overall concept, suddenly people kind of, they feel that they can't criticize, that the charity is somewhat immune to investigations like the one you're doing here. And so here we are at 501c3. That's the memo,
right?
In case people want to look it up.
Well, that's the code section on my site. If you start, there's a lot on my site, but if you start with something called the First Foundation Report that was written on April 20th, 2015, all this stuff is free and accessible on the site. You can read your way through, and you'll see there's a lot explained up there. Mm-hmm. But the first issue is, there's an important legal precedent that says in the United States a charity cannot be a, quote, formless aggregation. In other words, it can't be, Joni and Charles get together and we have no paperwork and no meetings and no nothing, and you put up $1,000 and I put up $10,000 and we start, flying around eating ice cream. You can't do that. You have to actually set up a nonprofit corporation or an association or a trust, and each of those entities, if they're created, must be organized lawfully and then operated lawfully, which means not only must it solicit, and we have special rules in most states and in some locations, we have rules that are beyond those of the federal government. So if you want to, you operate a charity in Little Rock and you come into my home state, adopted home state of New York, you've got to register as a corporation in New York. You've got to, if you're going to solicit in New York, you've got to fill out special paperwork on that. And each of these registration forms requires you to tell the regulator the truth, so that if your charity has ever been disciplined in the past, if a trustee of the charity has been disciplined in the past for lying under oath and obstructing justice, the way Bill Clinton was disciplined, resulting in him having to surrender his law license in Arkansas, and that before the Supreme Court, you have to disclose that.
You mentioned applying, but here in Canada, I know that I've applied for nonprofit status for a society, and it was an 18-month process to get approved as well. I just want to know, is it that you just put in the paperwork and you're set up, or is there an approval process whereby you get some sort of documentation saying, yeah, you're now a charity?
That's a very great question. So normally under U.S. law, the tradition has evolved over many decades that the federal government and state governments would like to see as many charities created as possible, under a theory that the people who do that are good-hearted, honest people, and will lessen the burden and cost of government on the rest of us. Mm-hmm. So it's typically been, until Lois Lerner, you may know that name, until Lois Lerner was put in charge of the division at the IRS, that decides how long it takes for you to get your federal tax exemption. It was customarily a very short period. You could get your federal tax exemption if you file your paperwork properly and are honest and truthful in it. You could get approved within a matter of months, short months. In fact, the Clinton Foundation put its federal application in on December 23rd, 1997, and they were approved on January 29th, 1998. That quickly. Now, Bill was president then, but mind you, that's a period in which impeachment talk was looming and the Monica Lewinsky scandal was looming and all that. He was able to, sail right through. In contrast, on Friday of last week, cowardly late in the afternoon, our Justice Department, strangely controlled in theory by Donald Trump, decided not to investigate Lois Lerner. For some would argue, and Judge Andrew Napolitano, who's a mentor and friend of mine, was on the air this morning saying it's outrageous that Lois Lerner it's so obvious that she broke the law. She absolutely should have been investigated and I think jailed and stripped of a lot of money, and if she's a lawyer, of her license to practice law. But no, the Trump Justice Department apparently has decided to let her off the hook, which just boggles the mind. Because there are multiple accounts of charities, conservative-leaning charities, that were tortured. I mean, not physically tortured, but, put through the mill of having to answer absurd questions and, taking many years to get close to authorization, and in some cases not even getting authorized. So I'm a huge fan. One of the reasons I got into this is, I don't actually like either political party, and I don't like political parties in general. I think they've outlived their utility. But if you're going to have a process, as we have here in the U.S. and as you have up in Canada, where there are laws, we shouldn't let that morph into a system where if one political party gains the majority or control, it has the right not only to persecute enemies, but to let friends break the law. You descend into anarchy, into a very dangerous place when you go in that direction. So that's exactly what's happened. It would appear that we're in a moment down here in the United States where Obama holdovers and Clinton holdovers and Bush holdovers appear to be obstructing the Trump administration in its attempts to uncover and investigate and then maybe prosecute massive charity frauds.
Right.
So we're in this very tenuous moment down here.
I want to tell my listeners that we're listening to Charles Ortel, who's talking to us from his home in New York City. Charles is well known for his various activities, but this one in particular is the investigation of the Clinton Foundation. We're here on CHLY 101.7 FM, and you're listening to CharacterDriven. I'm going to let Charles continue on because he definitely knows his stuff, and I'm just trying to clarify a little bit. There is this Canadian connection. We've actually created a pretty good foundation for what a charity is and what it's not. And then we have Frank Guistra, who comes on the scene as well. What is his tie, and how did he become involved with the Clintons generally and with the foundation aspect in particular?
All right, so if I could, I'll take an intermediate step and then we'll get to Guistra. So I think
Sure.
there are two wonderful books that help explain this because they're written by either Bill Clinton or allies of Bill Clinton. One is called Giving. It was written in 2007, September of 2007, and their news accounts suggesting that Bill Clinton was paid $6.4 million to write a book about about his charitable activities, and he gave only $1 million of that to charity. Now, that is really odd to start with. But in that book, it talked, in Bill's own words, which, maybe a ghostwriter wrote them and they didn't edit it properly, and Bill didn't really mean to say this, but in his book, published in 2007, for which he was paid $6.4 million, it's rumored, he says that he began fighting HIV/AIDS with donors, principally drawn from Canada and Ireland, and he named some other countries, starting in 2002. All right, so the ties between the Clinton Foundation and Canada, I think, preceded Guistra's involvement, which happened more like in 2005-06. But in 2002, by then, your country, is very generous in its international aid around the world, properly had focused upon the fact that, with the costs of HIV/AIDS drugs being as high as they were in the late 1990s, and with much of the supposed cases of HIV that would then morph into AIDS being in countries where people didn't have any money, properly your country and other countries said, we got to do something about it. And it was one of those causes down here. It's interesting when you get into the real facts. Bill Clinton, when he was president, actually opposed this in a sop to the pharmaceutical companies, the branded pharmaceutical companies. You remember that 98, 99, 2000 was a period when, the tech companies in the U.S. were very jealous of their intellectual property rights, and there were, big battles with tech drug to protect those rights. So actually, for quite a while in his presidency, Bill opposed this. And as he was opposing it, these Indian generic companies, some of which I'm afraid are really super crooked, were trying to break into these in quotes fertile markets and offering generic copies of these very expensive HIV/AIDS drugs. So that predated the Clinton Foundation's operations fighting international HIV/AIDS internationally. And in April, I believe it is, of 2001, shortly after Bill left, a bunch of, in quote, scholars, some serious doctors, but some, people with very thin credentials, though they were tied to Harvard, issued a statement on AIDS, which I think is, factually incorrect, mathematically incorrect, suggesting that, for a certain amount of money, they could treat all of these different cases. But when you look carefully at the actual schedules and the assumptions made no sense. It was rushed together. It got a huge outpouring of support. Celebrities around the world were very quick to embrace the cause. At surface level, it really makes sense. But with a charity in the health field, you always have to ask, is the charity giving away its services and these drugs for free, and actually suffering a cost, an economic penalty? Or is what the charity doing promoting the business interests of Indian generic drug companies and a South African generic drug company and a Chinese and an Indian maker of the active pharmaceutical ingredients that went into these drugs? Is this more a business development exercise to enrich the cronies who control these crooked companies,
right,
so that they can, make an argument that the growth trajectory these companies would be fantastic, and at a time when the rest of the world was looking for investments in India and South Africa and China, then sell those companies for fancy billions, which is exactly what happened. So right. Canada got involved supporting this early on, as did Ireland, as did the United Kingdom, as did a whole bunch of foreign countries. Now, under our system of charity laws, you have to disclose on what is called the 990, that's our IRS annual report. You have to, every entry in that report has to be true and accurate, and you cannot omit any material fact that would be positive or negative. You've got to actually fill it out properly, and there's many sections. You can write novels about what you did, but you've got to answer all the questions. Mm-hmm. And through 2007, though they were extensively operating internationally, they changed their purposes. They have to this date not disclosed on their tax forms in the U.S. the sums of any government grants, foreign and domestic, and in New York and in California, which have high taxes and strict reporting regimes, you're supposed to also provide individual details. So somebody can say, in Canada, we thought we gave you $16 million to fight HIV/AIDS in 2003. We don't see that anywhere in your tax form. What's going on here? And by the way, until 2006, though they were supposed to every year get a real audit, so somebody up in Canada could check, and in the various governments down here could check, they didn't get even attempt an audit that came close to complying with U.S. laws until 2006, which then brings us to the question, Mr. Guistra. So he has, there's a lot written about him, and he is, some would say he's a billionaire. Who knows? He's a very wealthy man. He has extensive interests, first, I think, in finance and entertainment, mining, and energy around the world. I believe he is based up there in Vancouver. Mm-hmm. And the press accounts suggest that he first began, getting close to Bill Clinton in 2005. In fact, there's a very good book written by a Clinton ally called Man of the World by Joe Conason. And in there's a lot of reporting about Guistra and how he may have gotten close to Bill. But Guistra, according to that book, thought he was giving money in the 2005-6 timeframe, roughly, to fight HIV/AIDS. But, at that time, the Clinton Foundation was not lawfully authorized to fight HIV/AIDS, A. And B, I believe Canadian charity law was changed in 2010. So that prior to 2010, it was very difficult to take a tax deduction as an individual for making a donation to a U.S. charity operating internationally. So there are a lot of defects in the Clinton Foundation filings. There are Canadian filings that are, I don't have all of them, but there are quite a few of them you can get up there. And these filings appear to suggest that the Clinton, there's two names of it. It's like Clinton Guistra Sustainable something and Clinton Guistra Enterprise something. These two entities, it says in Canadian paper, in Canadian websites and stuff, it appears to suggest that those two entities were, quote, controlled under an agency agreement by the Clinton Foundation in the United States. Well, the Clinton Foundation in the United States was never authorized to control those entities. And in its U.S. tax forms, we have a rule down here, a very strict rule that predates 9/11, that if you have more than a certain amount of money in an offshore bank account, even in a clean country like Canada, you got to disclose that. Mm-hmm. There's very serious forms you have to fill out. It's not, you don't just say, I have a bank account in Canada. You got to say, if it's more than $10,000 for the string of the international accounts, you've got to say what was the high balance, what was the low balance, what was the average balance, what was the starting balance, what was the ending balance, who has custody and control over it, all that stuff. And they've done none of those disclosures. They've done no disclosing in Canada of the fact that directors of these entities have serious defects in their records having to do with the flawed ways in which they failed to get, in my view, proper federal tax exemption for their HIV/AIDS operation. So a gentleman called Eric Nonacs, N-O-N-A-C-S, and Bruce Lindsay both, I think, have served, and may still be serving, as trustees of these Canadian operations without disclosing anywhere, but especially in Canada, the defects these gentlemen have in the horrible record of abuses, frankly, they have either not noticed or been participating in with something called Clinton Foundation HIV/AIDS Initiative, created 24 March 2004 in Arkansas, never validly authorized as a charity. They've hidden the federal tax returns off their website. I and associates have found them for 2004 and 5. They are riddled with errors, major league inaccuracies. And, none of this has been disclosed as far as I can tell up in Canada. All of this makes me wonder how carefully our own authorities and your authorities actually regulate charities.
And the big question here, too, is that the donors ultimately become liable at a certain point, too, or implicated in this whole situation if and when they do get audited and there are found to be discrepancies, or the fact that it never existed in the first place, because their donations are basically taxable at that point. Is that the case?
Well, so your rules are different than our rules. So let me start with what I believe are our rules. If a private foundation, so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, gives money to the Clinton Foundation and says that at the time they gave the money, the Clinton Foundation was a public charity, validly organized and operated, and they lie about that it's not the case, that in fact the Clinton Foundation was unlawfully organized and illegally operated, then the way our rules work, the IRS places the burden on the donor to seek to get that money back. And if the donor doesn't seek to get the money back, depending on how many times they fail to do it and the amounts involved, the IRS actually would have the right to go in and maybe shut the Gates Foundation down, shut the Rockefeller Foundation down, shut these big foundations down.
Yeah,
and the second piece of it is, the second piece of it is as well, when you under our system, when you go and you say, all right, we're going to do this ice cream charity, and we fill out all the paperwork, and let's say for some strange reason we get approved, that doesn't mean you're in the clear. You could get something wrongly approved, and the IRS can go back and look at it and say, we actually didn't realize what you were doing here, and we are going to retroactively revoke your charter. And there's no statute of limitations. There's no statute of limitations on that.
Wow. So basically, if you're found to have made a wrong disclosure, I guess even an error, let alone on purpose, or failed to disclose something on your application, then yeah, they leave it wide open to be able to go back and revisit it. Wow.
Right. And so, in the case, so in the case of the Clinton Guistra entities in Canada, I don't know. I mean, I think that the current Trudeau administration basically is in love, enthralled with the Clintons. So, they're not. Doesn't seem like they're going to do anything here. I don't understand why the Harper administration didn't do anything about it. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's as if this mess. I have said many times. I'll repeat on your show. This is the largest unprosecuted fraud in human history in financial terms.
Well, let's talk about that. Just give us a figure, because I think that our listeners need to hear Charles Ortel talk about the actual figure that we're discussing here. We're not talking about millions, but give us the figure.
Sure. So the big trick in a charity scam, I think, is not what's in the books, but what isn't in the books. So again, back to this ice cream charity. If we go ahead and let's say people around the world really want to support this charity, and they send us $1 billion, and we decide, because we're in this, our alter egos are crooked, we say, you know what, we're only going to say we raised $50 million. That's a lot of money, $50 million. We'll just say $50 million is what came in, and we'll steal $950. That's the real way in which charity fraud, the biggest way in which it happens. You assert that you're going to fight HIV/AIDS. You assert that you're going to help people in Haiti. You assert that you're going to principally go to countries where there are no controls, where these sad cases and horrible situations, so that the good-spirited, trusting, frankly, too gullible, people, grandmothers and grandfathers, and people who want to do well and they're kind-hearted, church groups and others, they'll say, well, all right, I'll give them $10 a month, and that just adds up. In these recent tragedies we've had, I'm sure Canadians are being very helpful to our people in Texas and Louisiana and Florida and elsewhere that are being afflicted by these hurricanes. The money, when there's a natural disaster or a disease epidemic, or the money just comes flooding in across PayPal and the internet in small bites that are very tough to check. So my estimate off the Clinton Foundation books, and then various entities. There's one called Unitate in Switzerland. There's another one called Global Fund in Switzerland. There's UNAIDS. There's a whole bunch of these large, multinational, unregulated charities that I would argue have it's at least $100 billion U.S. fraud. And then if you want to start talking about, when governments get behind, this happened in our country in 2009, a stimulus program, and decided we're going to burn $787 billion for an unregulated program with no accounting, and nobody knows what really happened to the money, or $15 billion down in Haiti. You start adding this up, and very quickly you're up in the trillions. And what we have here, I think, is we have, this may or may not be all that popular with your listeners, but my view is that globalism is a cult. Does not make any sense economically. There are 200 countries in the world. There are 20 to 40 developed markets in terms of infrastructure and wealth and roads and this and that. And the balance of the world's economies just don't have yet electricity and hospitals and doctors and nurses and roads and, people who've moved into the city and education. And they don't have it yet. So what in the richer countries, in Canada and the U.S. and France and England and other places, we have long histories and, in theory, laws and systems that work. But there is no regulator for these globalist schemes. And that's why people rush around and try to get you, to sign up for these programs, knowing that, the UN isn't controlled by anybody. When was the last time the UN produced numbers on anything they did that were checked by a serious team? And when you do these projects in corrupt countries, which is basically, the Clintons picked, we can riff on Arkansas. A lot of people down here in the United States like to make fun of Arkansas, but, New York, where I live, is not exactly free of corruption. So, you get involved in corrupt environments with massive sums that in theory are going to go to help people, where there's no controls, there's no independent audit, there's no check on people who might be giving money to a charity in hopes of either getting relief were Hillary to have won from prosecution, or a no-bid project, or both. There's no check on that.
Yeah.
And so, I would argue, particularly in today's day and age, where so many of the developed libraries are deciding that they really don't need all this space with the internet. They don't need to, keep these physical collections. There's better ways of doing it on the cloud and elsewhere. I would seriously argue that it's time for a relook, not simply at the presidential archives like this Clinton one and now Obama's presidential archive, but on the questions of, in the digital age, should we be thinking very differently if we care so much about heating and cooling and global warming and all that stuff? Should we be thinking more carefully about, do we really need all these gigantic buildings? Should Barack Obama really be going out to spend another $500 million, supposedly, constructing a library in Chicago?
Especially given the fact that when people are trying to get hold of some of the things that are going into the library, they're saying that they're being withheld from public scrutiny anyway. So, that's a whole other story. But there's so many different things that are not good about this system, and you're just naming one of many. But if they are really a repository for being able to do research and to take a look at what was happening during a presidency, that's not happening anyway.
Yeah, and on that, if your listeners Google, there's a gentleman, a lawyer called Stuart Dean, Stuart, Dean, D-E-A-N, who on Medium, which is one of those platforms, has an article that was picked up by Zero Hedge last night. Zero Hedge is a wonderful publication, online, free. And they picked it up, and I checked just before we got on this interview. In less than 24 hours, that thing has more than 80,000 views. So that's a lot. That's more than the Zero Hedge story on Steve Bannon, which got a lot of attention. So people are looking carefully at, what exactly was going on in Little Rock, has been going on. Was that complex used primarily as a meeting ground where donors who wanted to get close to the Clinton family, to tap into multinational aid flows, to tap into what might happen should she have won in 2008, should she have won in 2016? Is it just basically a way to extend Clintonism and advance globalism outside the scrutiny of the regulators? And if that is the case, there must be records in Canada of the people in your government who pulled the levers to wires to what bank accounts for what purposes, and how much diligence has been done on that. How much money has the government of Canada given the Clinton Foundation? I want to know.
Mm-hmm. Exactly that. There's just so many other things when it comes to that Canadian connection, because we have the uranium connection, we have the mining connection, we have the variety of different things Russia-related as far as the Clintons are concerned themselves, because there's a pay-to-play scheme that was taking place there. And I find it interesting that this whole idea of projecting nefarious activities going on between the present government and Russia is actually a bit of a reflection. It's a look in the mirror of what's been happening with the Clintons themselves, and how the Russians were paying the big bucks to Bill for speaking, and the various things that happened when Hillary was the Secretary of State. And that's why it's so hard to cram all of this stuff into an hour, because we've got about 10 minutes coming up to the top of the hour, and it seems like it's just flown by, because we're really just laying the foundation here of what the problem is. And I think even at this, people are kind of going, what's the big deal? The loss of tax dollars, for one thing. We talk about the military, we talk about all these things where we're spending tax dollars, but what about the legitimate taxes, I suppose, while all of us are slogging away and paying our taxes, and other people are getting these tax relief benefits as well as bringing in the money. So it's the pay-to-play aspect, it's all of these different other things that have far-reaching effects. I want to tell people that we're listening to Charles Ortel. This is CHLY 101.7 FM. You're listening to Character Driven, and we're coming up to the top of the hour. I apologize because I was going to give you a bit more warning, but I want to give the rest of the show to Charles. I do want to mention that he has a website, CharlesOrtel, ORTEL.com, and his Twitter handle is @CharlesOrtel, so it's CHRLES Ortel. You can follow Charles and find out so much more, and you can also communicate with him that way too, ask some questions that may come up. I do hope that we're going to have you on again, but I want to give you this few minutes that are remaining to just kind of encapsulate, if you can, what you want the listeners to know about this entire situation and how it involves all of us.
Sure. I've been doing a weekly show, which is creatively called Sunday with Charles, with Crowdsource the Truth. You can find at Crowdsource the Truth. And we will be covering every week this in about an hour-long show, which is, it's podcasted video. And on my site, there's a lot of information. But if you want something that really needs attention, that is the question of, were the drugs that have been distributed by the Clinton Foundation, the test kits that were used to detect whether or not victims had actually HIV and the precursor of AIDS and AIDS itself, were those drugs and test kits adulterated? Or were they thoughtfully, carefully managed and controlled? And unfortunately, the answer to the question seems to be that they weren't controlled, that they seem likely to have been adulterated. There's a company called Ranbaxy, Ranbaxy. If you Google that name with the words dirty medicine, you'll get to a long story in Fortune magazine that explains the $500 million settlement, that was legal settlement, that was negotiated in May of 2013, and some of the history there. That is a dirty company distributing dirty medicine, and the Clinton Foundation signed up to promote those products in October of 2003 and has attempted to hide its activities ever since by not really giving the kind of disclosures that you need to have in the Clinton Foundation tax forms that are available publicly. And sadly, Canadian citizens and your government likely subsidized this effort. So there might well be reluctance on the part of some in your government to admit what actually happened here. And until we do admit what happened here, we're not going to be able to correct this and make sure in the future that this happens as infrequently as possible. It is tough to administer drugs and medical care in these poor countries that don't have the infrastructure. I'm not saying it's easy to do it, but you shouldn't be going around the world soliciting money without admitting the defects in your record that may well have killed not only adults but children. And, that's, to me, that's very serious. And I think, people on the right and the left need to get together, find out what happened here. And if egregious offenses have occurred, people need to be held to account, and your government can help us do that. So please, on this broadcast, I ask for the help of your government.
Very, very good. And I think that in the case of the listeners who are an active lot, there are people that actually do care about these kinds of things. There are steps that can be taken in terms of asking the government to take accountability and also to consider their associations with the Clinton Foundation in particular and charities in general. And it's sad because there are legitimate charities, but I've taken to looking at their records online. You can if you can't find their records online or if they're not easily found, then I don't donate.
Right.
This is one of the big ones that is glaring. There's other ones, but it does have the overtones, and we haven't even gotten into LionsGate Studios and all the rest of it that has other tentacles. The other thing you're doing, I just want you to quickly tell people what you're doing tomorrow. It's a Hillary thing. Let's talk about that just for a second.
Well, quickly, what happened is that Hillary decided to write a book with the creative title "What Happened," which will be released to the public tomorrow. And there's a book signing in New York City above Union Square on 17th Street at the Barnes & Noble. And Jason Goodman and I will be there. We're not exactly sure when we're arriving and who we'll be talking to, but we're encouraging people in the New York area to go to that with signs saying, what happened to the audit? What happened to the money that was supposed to fight HIV/AIDS? What happened to the various missing people and records? And what happened to the money that was supposed to go to the poor people of Haiti in 2010? What happened to that money? And so we're hoping that people will actually start asking these questions and, more to the point, demanding answers. One positive thing I can end with is that if you were to bet against me and say that no government is going to touch this, I can't tell you why I know or exactly who it is or which governments are involved, but foreign governments are already taking a hard look at this. Canada runs the risk of being late to the party. And I would strongly encourage the Canadian government to, stop pussyfooting around, go back into the files all the way back to 2002, and fess up, what money was advanced by Canadian development operating in the name of the Canadian people and the government, what monies were advanced to which Clinton entities on which projects, and how come there hasn't been the kind of due diligence and accounting for those donations.
Right. Yes, and so that would be another thing that we can, ask the audience to look at and to continue to think about, because I think this is something that it's only the tip of the iceberg, and I think that there are investigations going on in a lot of places. Unfortunately, there seems to be a problem with people being able to testify often when investigations do come forward. When it comes to the Clintons, and that's a whole other discussion too. But there's also a good book called Clinton Cash that I think is helpful. There's a video online as well that helps explain some of these peripheral issues as well. But for more on the actual issues around the Clinton Foundation, Charles Ortel has done yeoman service in terms of, as you can tell, the minutiae, the information to do with the foundation itself, but charities in general. And I think it's amazing the work that you're doing, Charles, and I so appreciate it. And I just want to really encourage you and thank you for what you're doing with Jason, and hope that you will be back on the show again. And just one word too is that I came up with, I found out about your work through George Webb, and we've had him on the show before too. And I just want to mention to people that things are really heating up on Capitol Hill generally. Involves the DNC. It has all sorts of different tentacles out. So this story has a lot of different ways that it's going. Charles and Jason actually talk about very specific things on Sundays. So I encourage you to tune in. So thank you again, Charles, for agreeing to spend your hour or more with me. I so appreciate it.
Anytime, and keep up the great work. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and I'll say goodbye to you, and I'll say goodbye to my audience. You've been listening to Charles Ortel on CharacterDriven for the last hour, CHLY 101.7 FM, and again, you can find Charles at charlesortel.com, and his Twitter handle is the same name, and I'll spell the last name again, Ortel. 1L, and so that's at Charles Ortel if you want to follow him on Twitter, and I encourage you to do so because he's got up to the minute information. It's always changing and it's always interesting. Okay, thanks so much, Charles. We'll talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Thank you.